Welcome to the third installment of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Ottoman Greeks of the United States Digital History Project's Remembering 1922 video series. In this and all upcoming episodes of the series, the names of the interviewees have been coded to protect their identity. This episode presents the experiences of expulsion, escape, and migration from small cities, towns, and villages located to the south and west of Istanbul, which Greek and Anglophone historiography identifies as Eastern Thrace, and U.S. migration records of the early 20th century as European Turkey. According to the descendants' recollections, one cause for migration to the U.S. from Eastern Thrace was due to natural disasters. Freddie, whose family was from Hoshkoi, Organos in Greek, and Carol, whose family was from Aretsu or Darija, provide evidence of this push factor for migration. Freddie recalls that natural disasters caused his grandfather's onward migration to Istanbul.
They were very well-to-do in Ganos. Ganos was a rich town, little town. It was a waterfront. And my grandfather had ships. And what happened after a big storm, I think he lost it all the ships. And when I say ships, they were wooden, bigger than fishing vessels. He was taking those vessels from Istanbul over to the yacht, to Biryov, to Oganos. He was carrying wine, whatever it was he carrying. And then he became destitute, and they moved to Poli, to Constantinople, because they had a big fire and also an earthquake. The earthquake caused a fire, and they had to move from there and come to Istanbul and live in Istanbul.
As already noted in previous episodes, avoiding conscription into the Ottoman army was a primary push factor for migration to the U.S. When Freddie immigrated to the U.S., his decision on where to settle was based upon the prior migration of his uncle Kostas.
My uncle, Kostas, he was going to be drafted, and instead of going to the Turkish army, he came here to the United States in 1914.
Mark offered a similar recollection of his grandfather's decision to immigrate from Kirklareli, in Greek, Sarandeklissies.
When he left Thrace in 1910, one of the reasons was that he was being conscripted into some Ottoman, maybe into the army or in some kind of military service, and he decided he was getting out when he could. And again, this is shortly before the Balkan Wars, so this was the time for him to leave the country.
According to Mark, upon arrival to the U.S., his grandfather made several stops prior to his final settlement.
In New Jersey first, then ended up in Manhattan, and then ended up in Massachusetts.
Steve's father also migrated to escape from conscription into the Ottoman army. Steve recalls in detail how his father escaped from Istanbul.
They wanted to force him to join the Turkish army, and he refused, so they were after him. He didn't know what to do. He had to leave the house, leave everybody behind, and he had a pistol in his pocket and $60. No papers, no nothing. He escaped from the house because they were looking for him. In the streets, he met a small group of French sailors, merchant marines, and they told him, "Come with us, we hide you on our ship." They put him in the middle of the group, and they went to the port, walking. And the Turks at the gates, they did not see nothing. So he was hiding on a French ship, and he ended up in Marseille. Did not know the language, no money, no papers, no nothing. He threw the pistol in the sea when the ship started going, he knew some of his friends from the same area where he was born, he knew. So he contacted him. His friend was already established in Nice, so he went to meet with him, and they worked together, they lived together. They were both single young men, 21, 22 years old, and that was the beginning of their lives in France. He worked in a casino in those days. A lot of foreigners used to go there and gamble and have a good time. It was a very touristic area.
Jim's grandfather also migrated from Kirk-Ladali in 1906, but his migration path took a slightly different trajectory.
He came in 1906. I think he was the first of his siblings to come over. He had a brother who came in 1908, 2 years after him. He had another brother who came in 1910. Supposedly he was a ship jumper. He did go back in 1912 and then came over again in 1913. I did hear a story from my great aunt, his sister-in-law, about my grandfather when he came back to Saran-de-Glaciers. And she told me that he came back, that's in 1912, just before the outbreak of the Balkan Wars. And she was kind of said, he came with American Nike. He was the big American. He came with a suit and his watch and his gold chain, which was like they all had in those days. That's what first thing they bought when they had money. And then the Balkan Wars broke out. And the biggest battle of the Balkan Wars was fought right outside the town, the Battle of Kirkilise. And the Bulgarians were victorious. And the Bulgarians occupied the town. And my great aunt, she said, the Greeks, even though they were allies with the Bulgarians, they were still scared. And the Bulgarian soldiers were banging on the doors, let us in, we're thirsty, thirsty, thirsty. They didn't want to let him in. She said, your grandfather, big fancy American. He said, well, they're not going to do anything to us. And he let him in, and they proceeded to ransack the house, supposedly, so. And that's a story I heard. No, maybe my grandfather thought because he was American or that they were allies. Or also, my grandfather's oldest brother, the oldest sibling, was already living in Bulgaria. He had left Saran-de-Glaciers and moved to Varna, Bulgaria, and was married and settled in Varna as a tailor, because I think my grandfather's father was also a tailor.
While Jim's grandfather experienced transnationalism between the U.S. and Kirk-Ladali, Sheila's father escaped from Charkoi, also known as Peristasis in Greek, and wandered Greece for almost a decade.
So the harrowing story of my father's infancy, which my aunt told me, is that he was an infant in arms. So he was next to the youngest of 7 children. And they were fleeing the village because there was Turkish soldiers were coming in. So they fled into the mountains, into the night, to get away from this force. And an uncle, I don't know who this uncle was, carrying my father. He was a baby. They were fleeing into the mountains, trying to get away, escape, so they wouldn't be killed by the Turks. And my father was a baby, he was crying. And they all met up. They had some meet-up place that they were going to reassemble, the family and whoever else. And when the family met up, his oldest sister said, "Where's the baby?" His uncle said, "Oh, he was crying. We would have been discovered. I just left him under a tree." And my grandmother just completely fell apart. And she and the oldest sister rushed back to find him. I don't know how far back they had to go. They were afraid of getting caught, but they rescued him, found him under a tree crying. And from 1912 until 1920, they were not in Thrace. They were, kicked out. Between 1912 and 1913, they migrated along with, I think, many people in their village to central Greece. They went to Trikala and Volos, and they worked on the tobacco fields there. So these are people that had established lives and were turned into refugee migrant farm workers.
Sheila's father shared at least one amusing experience with her from his time as a child in Volos.
My father said he was playing by the water. You know, that's a huge bay. It's a very beautiful harbor, apparently. And he had a hat, and he was playing by the water, and his hat fell in the water. And there were British soldiers there, and they fished his hat out of the water for him. And he was very grateful because his mother would have beaten him. And ever after, he had a very positive feeling for British sailors.
Next, Sheila explains how her father and her family returned to Kavala, then Charcoy, only to leave again in fear of losing their lives. Upon arrival to the U.S., they faced a different kind of trauma.
In June 1913, Kavala was liberated from the Bulgarians, and so they went to Kavala after that. So from Volos and Trikala, they went to Kavala, and they lived there for 7 years. So that was a more stable time. And he did have a younger brother that died. He died at age 2. He died of diphtheria. My father had it also. They were both sick at the same time, but my father survived and he died. In 1920, they went back to Peristasis. The Greek government said, yeah, you can go back. And they went back for a few years. And then things were continually getting heated up again between Greece and Turkey. In August of 1922, they permanently left. Their village, Peristasis, is on the Sea of Marmara. And there's an island in the middle of the sea, a small island. And the Ottomans set fire to it. They burned it. It was only Greeks living there, and they burned it down. And they said, oh, we're next. Let's get out of here, basically. Those flames across the sea, so terrifying, so upsetting to them that they said, okay, this is it. We're done. Let's go. And the people who left were my father's mother, my father, and his 2 sisters came down through central Greece to Piraeus and took the boat to New York. The reason that my grandfather did not come with the family was that their oldest daughter was engaged to be married to a soldier who was still fighting in Turkey. Deep into Anatolia, he was one of those lucky guys. So they were waiting for her to get married, and then he was going to come over and join the family in New York. But in the meanwhile, the Congress passed a xenophobic law in 1924 excluding anybody from the Mediterranean. So even though pretty much his entire family was here, his 2 sons, 2 of his daughters, his wife, they didn't allow him to come. So my father never saw his father again.
Sandra describes a similar experience of family separation during their escape from Hoshkoi to Greece.
Yaya and her brother, the parents sent them to hide in the hills. Her father was actually, they hid from the Ottomans, so that's how they survived. Her father was a successful merchant who transported goods, by camel train, and he gave her this gold pocket watch. I mean, it's one with a chain, and it's to pay for their passage to Greece. I mean, their job was to get from Turkey to Greece, and that was to pay for the passage, the watch. And when they got to Greece, the captain of the ship gave her back the watch, which my dad still has. I don't know what happened to her brother. They separated at that point, and Yaya was a maid in a Jewish household in Thessaloniki.
Finally, Carol outlines in detail her grandfather's migration path from Constantinople to Galveston, Texas.
Then my grandfather, on my mom's side, I heard that when he came over, that he went to several places. Seems like in Constantinople, 11 November 1922, 18 November 1922, he was in Marseille. He seemed like he was only in Marseille maybe for 4 days. And then he went to Rada, which I think might be in Italy, Le Havre, in February of 1923. So that's like from November to February. He was in Mexico. Yeah, so he stayed in Mexico like a month. Veracruz was the port that he came into in Mexico. And then Progreso, Mexico, that was another way. And then he went up to Galveston from there. So he came in illegally.
As the recollections of interviewees in this episode have shown, migration from towns in eastern Thrace was multifaceted. We heard experiences of transnationalism between Greece, the US, and the Ottoman Empire. Some migrated to save their lives from Ottoman forces, others to escape from the calamities caused by natural disasters. Still others migrated to escape conscription, and finally, some migrated in search of socioeconomic upward mobility. Their migration paths were convoluted. In addition, for them to circumvent legal obstacles resulting from restrictive laws, they made physical journeys to places that were not required for migrants who arrived in the U.S. prior to their enactment. Finally, we heard experiences of family separation resulting from those same restrictive laws. In the next episode, we will shift our focus further east to compare these themes with those of immigrants and refugees from towns and cities on the Black Sea coast of the Ottoman Empire. The researchers at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Ottoman Greeks of the United States Digital History Project would like to thank you, our listeners, for your support of this important research. We look forward to your comments and hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed producing it. See you next time.